What if the most dangerous thing about New York is not what you fear, but what you were taught to ignore? In the first moments of arrival, before crime statistics or headlines even matter, many visitors feel something unsettling. A quiet tension in the air, a sense that the city is not welcoming you, but testing you. New York is sold globally as the ultimate urban dream, a symbol of ambition, safety through prosperity, and limitless opportunity. Movies, series, and social media repeat the same. Promise. If you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. But that promise collapses the moment you step outside the curated image and into the lived reality of the streets. The shock is not immediate chaos or cinematic violence. It is subtler, more disturbing. It is the realization that entire neighborhoods operate under rules no tourist brochure explains. The sidewalks feel charged with urgency. Faces move fast without eye contact, and survival instincts quietly replace curiosity. This is not the New York of postcards. This is the New York of constant alertness, where the line between normal life and risk has blurred beyond recognition. What makes this especially dangerous for visitors is expectation. People arrive believing that danger is isolated, exceptional, or clearly marked. In reality, risk in New York is often invisible, embedded in patterns of neglect, social fracture, and systemic exhaustion. The city did not suddenly collapse. It eroded. And erosion creates environments where danger feels ordinary, almost routine. That is precisely why it catches outsiders off guard. Certain neighborhoods embody this collapse more clearly than others, not because they are inherently evil or chaotic, but because they sit at the intersection of broken promises, underfunded services, failing infrastructure, unchecked social decay, and a population pushed beyond psychological limits. These areas are not accidents. They are symptoms of a city that kept selling an image long after the foundation started cracking. Visitors often misread these spaces. They confuse normal activity with safety. They assume crowds equal protection, or that proximity to famous landmarks guarantees order. But in a city under chronic stress, crowds can mean anonymity, and anonymity can mean vulnerability. The danger is not always aggression. Sometimes it is indifference. Sometimes it is the absence of anyone willing or able to intervene. What we are about to explore is not a list meant to scare, but a reality meant to ground you. These neighborhoods are not warnings because they are exotic or extreme. They are warnings because they reflect where the urban dream breaks down first. And once you see how that breakdown happens, you start noticing similar patterns everywhere else in the city. Before naming names, before pointing to maps, it is essential to understand this. New York's most risky neighborhoods are not failures of individuals, but failures of systems. And that failure does not stay contained. It spreads quietly, block by block, until fleeing is no longer paranoia, but instinct. If this opening already challenged the image you had of New York, pause for a second and think about why that discomfort exists. Understanding what is really happening beneath the surface of this city is not about fear. It is about awareness. And awareness only grows when people stop consuming myths and start questioning realities. That is why your participation matters here. Leave a comment sharing what surprised you the most so far, or simply write, "The urban dream is breaking," if this resonates with what you have seen or felt. If this kind of deep, honest analysis helps you see cities differently, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because what comes next goes far beyond headlines and tourist narratives. The moment risk becomes routine, a city crosses an invisible threshold. In New York, this shift did not happen overnight. It unfolded quietly, through repetition. Sirens became background noise. Police tape became familiar scenery. People learned when to walk faster, when to look down, when not to react. What once would have triggered alarm slowly transformed into something closer to urban muscle memory. And that normalization is where danger truly begins. For visitors, this is the most misleading part of the city. Nothing looks immediately catastrophic. Trains still run, cafes stay open, lights remain on. On the surface, life appears functional, but beneath that functionality lies a constant state of low-level threat that residents have learned to absorb. Locals adapt. Outsiders do not, and that difference is critical. When a neighborhood trains its inhabitants to stay alert at all times, it stops being a neutral environment and becomes a stress zone. In many of these risky areas, danger is no longer an event, it is a condition. People do not talk about it openly because acknowledging it would mean admitting that the system failed. Instead, behaviors change. People avoid certain blocks after dark. They choose specific subway cars. They plan routes based on instinct rather than maps. None of this appears on tourist guides, yet it governs daily survival. What makes this normalization especially corrosive is how it reshapes perception. When broken windows, aggressive encounters, and visible distress become ordinary, the threshold for intervention rises. Someone yelling in public draws fewer reactions. Someone clearly unstable is given space rather than help. The city develops a collective habit of looking away, not out of cruelty, but out of exhaustion. That exhaustion spreads across neighborhoods, quietly lowering the standard of what is considered acceptable. This is where visitors miscalculate. They assume that if locals are calm, the situation must be safe. They confuse silence with stability, but silence can also signal resignation. In areas under constant pressure, people conserve energy by disengaging. They do not confront, they do not escalate, they move on. That creates an environment where risky behavior can exist in plain sight without immediate consequences. Every major city faces moments of tension. What sets certain New York neighborhoods apart is how permanent that tension has become. It is woven into the rhythm of the street. It shapes how people stand, how they wait, how they scan their surroundings. The city is not screaming. It is whispering warnings over and over to those who know how to listen. Long before crime rates spike or official reports acknowledge decline, some neighborhoods begin to change in ways that are impossible to quantify but easy to feel. In New York, the earliest signs of collapse are rarely statistical. They are behavioral. Conversations shorten. Patience thins. Public spaces lose their sense of shared ownership. What once felt communal starts to feel contested, as if everyone is negotiating. Invisible boundaries that no one agreed on but everyone understands. These neighborhoods do not announce their deterioration with dramatic events. Instead, they signal it through atmosphere. Trash lingers longer. Stores install heavier security before incidents justify it. Building lobbies feel tense rather than neutral. The streets are not empty, but they are emotionally vacant. People occupy space without connecting to it. That emotional withdrawal is one of the clearest indicators that something deeper is breaking. Visitors often misinterpret these environments. They see activity and assume vitality, but activity does not equal health. In many of these areas, movement is driven by necessity, not choice. People are passing through, not belonging. And when belonging erodes, accountability follows. Small acts of disorder go unchecked, not because no one cares, but because no one feels responsible anymore. This is where social collapse becomes visible before it becomes measurable. You notice how conflicts escalate faster, how misunderstandings turn aggressive without warning, how stress leaks into everyday interactions. These are not isolated personalities acting out. They are symptoms of prolonged pressure. When people live in environments where basic stability feels uncertain, their tolerance for friction disappears. One of the most dangerous misconceptions is believing that these neighborhoods are dangerous only at night. In reality, daylight reveals more than darkness. During the day, you see the systems failing in real time. Overcrowded services, delayed responses, public workers stretched beyond capacity. The city functions, but barely. And barely functioning systems create unpredictable outcomes. What makes this especially risky for visitors is that none of it looks cinematic. There are no clear villains, no dramatic warnings, just a slow accumulation of signals that something is off. Locals learn to read those signals instinctively. Outsiders often cannot. They rely on logic when the environment requires intuition. These neighborhoods are not anomalies. They are early indicators. They show what happens when economic pressure, housing instability, mental health neglect, and institutional fatigue converge in the same physical space. And once those patterns take root, they rarely stay contained. They migrate, block by block, following the same invisible logic. Every city claims that safety is guaranteed by systems: police, presence, public transportation, lighting, emergency response, sanitation, social services. In New York, these systems still exist on paper, but in certain neighborhoods they no longer function as protection. They function as placeholders, symbols of order without the capacity to enforce it consistently. And that gap between appearance and reality is where risk quietly multiplies. The failure here is not dramatic, it is procedural. Response times stretch just long enough to matter. Patrols pass, through without stopping. Reports are filed, but patterns repeat. Infrastructure works, but only barely. When systems operate at the edge of collapse, they stop preventing problems and start reacting too late. For residents, this creates a dangerous understanding. Help is uncertain. For visitors, it creates a false sense of security. Streetlights flicker, cameras exist but do not deter. Subways run, but platforms feel unmanaged. These details seem small, yet together they send a powerful signal. When oversight weakens, behavior changes. People test boundaries. Not always consciously, but instinctively. The city teaches them that consequences are delayed or inconsistent. And inconsistency is an invitation. What makes this especially unsettling is that these neighborhoods are not lawless. They are overregulated and underprotected at the same time. Rules exist, enforcement does not. Bureaucracy expands while presence retreats. This imbalance creates frustration on all sides. Residents feel abandoned. Authorities feel overwhelmed. No one feels in control. Visitors often assume that visible infrastructure equals safety: a busy station, a marked vehicle, a uniform nearby. But safety is not about visibility. It is about reliability. And in areas where systems are stretched thin, reliability disappears first. That is when informal rules take over: who you avoid, where you stand, when you leave. These unwritten codes govern survival more than official policies ever could. This breakdown also reshapes behavior in subtle ways. People stop reporting minor incidents, then moderate ones. Eventually, only extremes reach attention. The city becomes quieter on record and louder in reality. Statistics improve while lived experience deteriorates. That disconnect is one of the most dangerous illusions urban systems create. Once systems fail silently, they stop acting as deterrents and start acting as background noise. And background noise does not protect anyone. It numbs. It teaches residents to self-manage risk and teaches visitors nothing at all. These neighborhoods reveal a hard truth. A city does not collapse when systems disappear. It collapses when systems remain visible, but no longer matter. And once that line is crossed, danger stops being exceptional and starts being structural. Gentrification is often sold as improvement, but in New York it frequently functions as a slow eviction process disguised as progress. In many of the city's most risky neighborhoods, danger does not come only from crime or disorder. It comes from instability, from the quiet realization that you no longer belong where you live, even before you are physically forced out. As rents rise beyond reason, long-term residents are pushed into survival mode. They work more, sleep less, and accept conditions they would have rejected years earlier. Stress becomes permanent. Community networks fracture. The people who once watched each other's doors leave, replaced by short-term residents with no attachment to the area. This is not renewal. It is erosion. What makes these neighborhoods especially volatile is the collision of two worlds. New wealth enters without absorbing the social fabric that already exists. Meanwhile, those being priced out remain trapped in limbo. They cannot afford to stay comfortably, but cannot leave without losing jobs, schools, and social ties. That pressure builds resentment, anxiety, and unpredictability. A neighborhood under economic siege becomes emotionally unstable. Visitors rarely notice this tension because it hides behind polished storefronts and renovated facades. A cafe opens where a family business once stood. Apartments are staged for marketing, not living. On the surface, everything looks cleaner, safer, more desirable. But beneath that surface lies displacement, anger, and loss. And loss, when unacknowledged, does not disappear. It transforms. In these areas, risk increases not because people are inherently dangerous, but because they are under constant threat of erasure. When survival feels uncertain, patience disappears. Trust evaporates. Minor conflicts escalate faster because everyone is operating on depleted emotional reserves. The city feels sharper, less forgiving. This is why some of the most dangerous moments in New York happen in neighborhoods labeled as up and coming. They are neither stable nor cohesive. They are transitional. And transition is fertile ground for conflict. Old rules no longer apply, and new ones have not settled yet. Visitors stepping into these spaces misread the energy. They see investment, not displacement, opportunity, not anxiety. Gentrification also creates invisible borders. Certain streets feel safe, others tense. These boundaries shift constantly, making intuition unreliable for outsiders. What was fine last year may feel hostile today. And without local knowledge, visitors walk into social fault lines they do not understand. Tourism in a collapsing urban system creates a dangerous illusion. Visitors move through neighborhoods assuming visibility equals safety, believing that if a place appears active, photographed, and reviewed, it must be controlled. In New York, that assumption fails quickly. Some of the most unstable areas are not hidden. They are exposed. They sit along transit lines, near attractions, beside hotels, woven directly into tourist movement. And that proximity is precisely what turns visitors into easy targets. The risk is not always violent. Often it is situational. Tourists move slower. They hesitate. They look lost. They check phones instead of surroundings. In neighborhoods under stress, that behavior stands out immediately. Not because residents are predatory by nature, but because desperation sharpens perception. In areas where people are struggling to hold ground economically and psychologically, vulnerability is noticed fast. What makes these zones especially deceptive is how normal they look at first glance. Cafes are open. Stores are stocked. Music plays. The chaos is not explosive. It is layered. A visitor may walk 3 blocks without incident and conclude that warnings are exaggerated. Then one small misstep happens. A wrong turn, a delayed train, a moment of distraction, and suddenly the environment feels very different. Tourism also accelerates tension in neighborhoods already stretched thin. Short-term visitors bring money, but not responsibility. They use space, without investing in it. For residents, this feels like being observed rather than supported. The neighborhood becomes a stage. That dynamic increases resentment and reduces empathy. And when empathy disappears, unpredictability rises. Airports, transit hubs, and major corridors amplify this problem. These systems funnel outsiders directly into fragile zones without context. The city does not warn them. It markets movement, not understanding. As a result, visitors enter environments governed by informal rules they do not know exist. Locals navigate by instinct. Tourists navigate by maps. That mismatch is dangerous. Another overlooked factor is how fatigue affects decision-making. Visitors are tired, overstimulated, and emotionally overloaded. They assume risk is an exception rather than a condition. In neighborhoods where stress is permanent, exceptions are rare. The city does not adjust to visitors. Visitors are expected to adapt instantly. These areas are not traps because they are exotic. They are traps because they are transitional. They sit between order and neglect, between promotion and abandonment. And that in-between state is where systems fail fastest. Fear in these neighborhoods is not a reaction. It is a constant background condition. It does not spike and fade. It settles in. Over time, it reshapes how people move, how they speak, and how they interpret one another. In parts of New York under prolonged stress, fear becomes part of the urban landscape, as permanent as concrete or steel. Residents learn to live inside it. They adjust posture, pace, and awareness without thinking. They scan reflections in windows. They track footsteps behind them. They memorize which corners feel wrong at certain hours. This is not paranoia, it is adaptation. The city trains people to stay alert because the cost of not paying attention is too high. For visitors, this environment is exhausting because they have not developed those reflexes. They experience in days what residents endure for years. The psychological toll of this constant vigilance is severe. When fear becomes normalized, the body never fully relaxes. Stress hormones remain elevated. Small irritations trigger outsized reactions. Empathy declines, not because people become cruel, but because they are depleted. A city under permanent tension slowly loses its ability to care, even about itself. What makes this especially dangerous is how invisible it is to outsiders. Fear does not announce itself. It hides behind routine. People still go to work. Children still play. Life continues. But it continues under pressure, like a structure carrying more weight than it was designed to hold. Eventually, something gives, often without warning. In these neighborhoods, public spaces stop functioning as places of rest. Parks become transitional zones. Benches are not for sitting, but for watching. Waiting feels risky. Standing still feels exposed. Movement becomes a form of protection. The city teaches people that lingering is unsafe, and that lesson seeps into behavior unconsciously. Visitors misread this energy. They assume distance equals safety. They believe staying alert is enough. But fear as a landscape changes the rules. It compresses reaction time. It shortens patience. In an environment where everyone is already on edge, misunderstandings escalate quickly. A glance lasts too long. A gesture is misread. The margin for error disappears. This is how a city quietly turns hostile without ever appearing violent on the surface. Fear does not need explosions or headlines. It only needs repetition, day after day, block after block, until it becomes normal. What makes this collapse even more dangerous is not just what is happening on the streets, but what is missing from the narrative. Entire neighborhoods live with daily instability, yet the dominant image of New York remains carefully protected. Media coverage favors spectacle or success stories, not slow decay. The city is framed as resilient, vibrant, unstoppable. And in doing so, the most fragile areas are edited out of the story. This silence is not accidental. New York is a global brand. Tourism, investment, and prestige depend on maintaining the illusion of control. Showing gradual social breakdown does not fit that image, so the story becomes selective. Crime is discussed in abstract numbers. Infrastructure failures are described as temporary inconveniences. Human stress is reduced to individual anecdotes. The systemic picture is never allowed to fully form. For residents, this creates a sense of abandonment. Their lived reality does not match the official narrative. They feel unseen, unheard, and invalidated. When a city refuses to acknowledge what people experience daily, trust collapses. And when trust collapses, cooperation disappears. People stop believing that reporting problems will change anything. Silence becomes a survival strategy. Visitors are the unintended victims of this denial. They arrive informed by marketing, not reality. They expect problems to be isolated, contained, exceptional. Instead, they encounter environments shaped by long-term neglect that was never honestly discussed. The danger is not that the city hides crime. The danger is that it hides deterioration. And deterioration creates unpredictable conditions. This denial also normalizes the absurd. Escalating homelessness becomes background scenery. Overcrowded shelters are treated as permanent features. Public spaces lose their function, and no one asks why anymore. When dysfunction becomes familiar, it stops being questioned. That is how collapse embeds itself into everyday life without triggering alarm. The most troubling part is how quickly people adapt to this distortion. Residents learn to lower expectations. Visitors rationalize discomfort. Media shifts focus. The city keeps moving forward, not because it is healthy, but because stopping would require confrontation. And confrontation threatens the myth. These neighborhoods are not invisible. They are deliberately overlooked. And what is overlooked does not get fixed. It spreads quietly, protected by denial and branding. One of the most dangerous illusions about New York is the belief that collapse stays contained, that there are bad areas and safe areas, as if decline respects boundaries or waits for permission. In reality, urban decay moves the way stress moves through a body, quietly, gradually, almost politely, until suddenly it is everywhere. Neighborhoods once described as stable begin to show familiar signs. Not dramatic crime waves, but subtle shifts. Stores change hours because staff no longer feel safe closing late. Residents start avoiding certain subway entrances. Conversations about safety move from speculation to habit. These are not overreactions. They are early adaptations, and they follow a pattern that has already played out elsewhere in the city. What spreads first is not violence, but instability. Housing turnover accelerates. Long-term residents leave, replaced by people who do not expect to stay. Community memory disappears. When no one plans for the future, no one protects the present. That vacuum invites neglect, and neglect invites risk. Infrastructure tells the story before headlines do. Maintenance becomes reactive instead of preventive. Transit delays increase. Public complaints multiply without resolution. The city still functions, but the margin for error shrinks. Systems designed to absorb pressure start transferring it to individuals. Each person becomes responsible for their own safety, their own judgment, their own exit plan. Visitors sense this spread without understanding it. They notice that areas recommended 5 years ago now feel tense. That routes once considered normal now raise questions. The map in their head no longer matches the street in front of them. This disorientation is not personal. It is structural. The city has changed faster than its reputation. What makes this progression especially deceptive is that it does not announce itself as decline. It presents as inconvenience, as discomfort, as something feels off. People dismiss it because it lacks drama. But collapse rarely begins with chaos. It begins with normalization, with people quietly adjusting expectations downward. As this spread continues, the idea of safety becomes fragile. Not because danger is everywhere, but because predictability is gone. And unpredictability is what makes urban environments truly risky. When you cannot rely on patterns, instincts replace planning. For residents, that instinct is learned. For visitors, it is delayed. The most unsettling realization is this. By the time a neighborhood is widely labeled as dangerous, the process has already moved on. The real risk lies in the places still pretending everything is fine. There comes a moment in every collapsing city when staying is no longer framed as resilience, but as denial. In New York, that moment rarely arrives with drama. There is no single headline, no official warning, no clear signal that says it is time to leave. Instead, the body understands before the mind does, the hesitation before stepping onto a block, the calculation before boarding a train, the quiet question that keeps returning. Why am I forcing myself to tolerate this? In the most unstable neighborhoods, fleeing is not panic. It is pattern recognition. It is the accumulation of small warnings finally outweighing the stories people tell themselves. The myth of toughness, of urban pride, of proving you can handle it, slowly loses power when everyday life becomes a series of compromises. Less sleep, less trust, less freedom to move without thinking. What makes this especially dangerous for visitors is the belief that endurance equals intelligence, that pushing through discomfort is part of the authentic New York experience. But there is a difference between challenge and exposure, between culture shock and structural risk. When a city reaches a point where leaving feels like relief rather than loss, something fundamental has already broken. These neighborhoods force an uncomfortable question. At what point does adapting become surrender? At what point does loyalty to a place turn into self-neglect? Cities are supposed to serve the people who live in them, not test their limits daily. When survival instincts replace curiosity and joy, the urban dream has already failed. The most revealing sign is not fear, but exhaustion. People stop arguing about conditions. They stop hoping for improvement. They focus on exits, physical exits, mental exits, emotional exits. That shift is subtle, but irreversible. Once the idea of leaving becomes comforting, the relationship with the city has changed permanently. New York still markets ambition, excitement, and opportunity. But in these neighborhoods, the real skill is knowing when to walk away. Not because you are weak, but because you are paying attention. Survival is not about bravery. It is about timing. If you have ever felt that staying required more denial than courage, comment "knowing when to leave" below. That instinct is not failure. It is clarity. If you stayed until this point, it means you were not just watching a video. You were confronting a reality most people prefer to avoid. That already sets you apart. If this analysis helped you see New York and modern cities in general with clearer eyes, take a second to support this work. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next deep dives into urban collapse, social decay, and the human cost hidden behind glossy images. Leave a like if this content made you think differently. And in the comments, write "clarity over illusion" to let me know you stayed until the end and understood the message. Now stay with me and watch the next video appearing on your screen, because this story does not stop here.